Good evening, buenas noches, and thank you for tuning in. On behalf of all of us at the locally based, independently owned bookstore, Books and Books in Miami, Florida, and in partnership with Miami Book Fair, it's my pleasure to welcome you to a virtual evening with Ben Rhodes to discuss his new book, After the Fall, Being American in the World We've Made, published by our friends at Random House. Ben Rhodes is a writer, political commentator, and national security analyst. He is currently a contributor for NBC News and MSNBC, co-host of Pod Save the World, a senior advisor to former President Barack Obama, and chair of National Security Action, which he co-founded with Jake Sullivan in 2018. From 2009 to 2017, Ben served as a deputy national security advisor to President Obama, and later wrote the New York Times bestseller, The World as It Is, a memoir of the Obama White House, which we were lucky enough to present at the Coral Gables Bookshop what seems like many moons ago now. To moderate tonight's conversation, we're joined by Jon Meacham. Jon is a Pulitzer Prize-winning biographer, the author of the New York Times bestsellers, Thomas Jefferson, The Art of Power, American Lion, Andrew Jackson in the White House, Franklin and Winston, Destiny and Power, The American Odyssey of George Herbert Walker Bush, and The Soul of America, The Battle for Our Better Angels. He is a distinguished visiting professor at Vanderbilt University, a contributing writer for the New York Times Book Review, and a fellow of the Society of American Historians. Throughout this evening's broadcast, you're invited to post questions by using the Ask a Question feature at the bottom of the screen, and you can order your copy of After the Fall from Books and Books below by pressing the green button. We appreciate each and every order and the generous donations from viewers everywhere. And now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome our guests to the virtual stage. Hello. Welcome, welcome.
Thank you. I'm going to take moderating privilege and thank our friends in Miami. Books and Books has been a longtime friend of mine. And so hit the green button a lot, buy the whole Rhodes canon, then buy some Trollope, buy some Jane Austen. It's a long summer ahead. So I'm honored to be here with my friend Ben. And I'm just going to jump right in. There's nothing more resonant right now than the tension between democracy and autocracy. The incumbent president, with whom Ben served in the Obama White House, has made that a recurring theme. And I'm intrigued, Ben, by the title. Define, if you would, when you think the fall happened.
Well, and thanks, John, for doing this, and thanks to Books and Books. I had a great time there, what seems like about a million years ago. So I went out, John, kind of in search of this answer to the question of what had happened to democracy in the world. Why was it so under siege in the United States and in other places around the world? And what I ended up doing is I found, the jumping off point for me was a Hungarian who I talked to, who said, look, while I was talking to him, I said, how did you guys go from being a democracy to essentially a single-party autocracy in a decade after Viktor Orban got elected prime minister? And he said, well, that's simple. Orban got elected on a right-wing populist backlash to the financial crisis. Then he redrew the parliamentary districts to entrench his party in power, kind of packed the courts with far-right judges. He changed the voting laws to make it easier for his supporters to vote. He enriched some cronies on the outside who financed his politics and then bought up the media, turned it into kind of a right-wing propaganda machine, used social media to kind of further flood the zone. And he wrapped it all up in a nationalist message, us versus them, us, the real Hungarians, them, immigrants, Muslims, liberal elites, George Soros. And I'm thinking, well, this sounds very familiar. And so I, having lived that experience in the United States, I felt for the last decade with the Republican Party, I ended up looking at different places where there's a different flavor of this kind of nationalist authoritarianism. Which took me to China and Hong Kong and Russia and Hungary and the United States. And, obviously I think that the fall that I refer to in the title really is the Trump presidency. But what I end up doing is kind of tracing in each place, because that's what I was told by the people I spoke to, the fall essentially from the high watermark of the end of the Cold War, when it seemed like these questions were settled. It seemed like it was the end of history, that freedom and democracy and open markets were going to kind of wash across the world and water a million seeds. And each of these other countries I looked at were on the other side of the Iron Curtain. And in some way, what I found is there's been a pretty steady fall for democracy after kind of the explosion of the 90s, since the early 2000s, that the financial crisis itself was a much more kind of cataclysmic event than even I fully appreciated at the time working in the White House. And then kind of the bottom falls out under Trump, of course. But a part of what I discovered and I wanted to communicate in the book is that there's some trends structurally that have been building for some time now in terms of globalization and capitalism not delivering for people, creating a sense of inequality that nationalists could exploit, the kind of post 9/11 wars and the us versus them brand of politics that unleashed in this country and in other places, and this rise of social media and disinformation, which has been the perfect tool for authoritarianism. Those trends were building, and then Trump here in this country, I think, kind of completed the process of America no longer being this kind of dominant power and no longer being able to take for granted that this question of our own democracy was settled.
So is this a difference of degree or kind?
This is a really good question. So my old boss, Barack Obama, is also a character in this book. And, he was more the optimist in some ways, in that his point to me was, I kind of walked him through. He comes in and out of the book as I'm kind of telling him my progress and what I'm learning. And so that it's interesting to kind of trace his reactions to what I was hearing around the world. And, he said to me, look, Ben, you have to remember that this is a cycle. There's always a competition in this country about what it means to be American, about how true we are going to be to that better story we tell about being a multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy. And in a sense, he was saying, don't get down. The same thing happens over and over. I do think, though, that there are some things that are qualitatively different than past times. And for me, I'd really highlight two things that are interrelated. One is technology. And technology in the United States is experienced mostly through what is the impact of social media on our discourse and on the ability of people to agree upon a basic set of facts and live in a common reality. And what's happened in this country, which is also what I found has happened in other places, particularly places like Russia, where Putin has really manipulated the information flow to people, is that you have, a huge chunk of people who are truly living in a world of different facts than the world I inhabit. And at the extreme versions of this, you see a conspiracy theory mindset that obviously Donald Trump himself represented. Everything from the big lie about the US election to QAnon, but to a million little conspiracy theories that all serve to kind of diminish people's confidence in institutions and distrust government itself. And I think that's new. I think that the risk, the challenge of people being in these kind of hermetically sealed information bubbles is something we haven't fully experienced. We've had, as historians like you have well documented, partisan media in this country. We've had disinformation, but not on the scale that technology affords. And I think that's something we're going to have to wrestle with. And that leads to a kind of a related and I think distinct challenge. I really do think, and I'm not happy about this, that the illiberalism of the Republican Party right now is something that we haven't really seen much of, at least in our recent history. I mean, obviously we have at different junctures in American history, but I sense this, John, when I was in the White House, and I write about kind of the rise of the Tea Party. These were different kinds of people getting elected from 2010 on. They didn't want to just debate, the size of government and tax policy and national security policy. There was a kind of ruthlessness to how they sought to accumulate power. That's not unlike, again, what I described in Hungary. And I think, that's obviously tied in part to the fact of people living in an alternative reality. It's kind of symbiotic with it. And I think that does pose a unique test, even if this is a version of the generational challenge that happens again and again in America about who are we, what is our democracy, who is it for, who gets to be an American, and what does that mean?
Yeah, yeah, I think you're right. I think the difference, to me, the delta here is that one of the two major parties in the constitutional structure has taken leave of its senses.
Yeah.
And I don't say that as a partisan in any way. It's just self-evidently true that that frankly the Democratic Party at this point doesn't have a partner for peace, to use a Middle Eastern analogy.
Yeah.
And I do think that is a difference that was not even true 4 or 5 years ago.
Yeah.
I was like President Obama. I was optimistic about this, the ebb and flow of history, the battle between our worst instincts and our better angels. But that battle only works if there are, in fact, two parties, two forces that, in fact, are devoted to the same experiment.
Yeah. And
the Republican embrace of the will to power at any cost, I think, is the key distinction, which in my sense, is that you have to go to the 1850s to find this, where the slaveholding interest was as devoted to their own vision of reality, with its own theology, its own economics, its own canonical texts to get there. What's the lesson from abroad? What should we be doing?
Well, I mean, there's a negative lesson and hopefully a positive lesson, right? On the negative side, I mean, part of what I wanted to illustrate is that there's kind of one trend happening everywhere. And look, I mean, people, you can see this plainly from Vladimir Putin to Xi Jinping to Erdogan in Turkey to Bolsonaro in Brazil to obviously Orban in Hungary. And unfortunately, I could go on, Modi in India. Most of humanity right now is living in a circumstance where their country is moving towards this kind of nationalist authoritarianism. We bucked that trend with Biden's election. And, there are a lot of reasons for that. I mean, what I'd kind of shorthand here is, Bao Pu is a Chinese character in this book who I talked to, was in Tiananmen Square. His father was senior in the party. He kind of, after watching his friends get shot down, he goes to the United States. He goes to Hong Kong, where he publishes books critical of the Chinese Communist Party. He made this point to me that, in a way, the 20th century was about ideology. It was about isms, fascism, communism, capitalism, and democracy. After the end of the Cold War, you see this kind of return to a sense of more identity-based politics. What does it mean? The Chinese Communist Party, in this telling from him, is kind of reinvented itself, not as a communist party, but as a nationalist party. And that with globalization, there was kind of an opening for people to offer that traditional sense of identity and belonging. That's what Orban did in Hungary. That's what Putin did in Russia. Tapping into people's grievances about if they feel like they were left out of the benefits of globalization. I'm going to offer you now the oldest story in the book, the blood and soil nationalist story, the ethno-nationalist story. And it's interesting to contend with that in Europe, right, which should have learned this lesson better than anybody in World War I and II. But what I also heard from somebody was a really interesting, I think, argument was essentially that we're moving beyond the memory of that time, that the shock of World War II and the Holocaust kind of sobered up the world to create some international institutions and a set of norms and some kind of guardrails around the way in which nations interacted, led to kind of a focus on human rights, I think, after the horror of the Holocaust, and in a sense that at least there's the aspiration to protect individual liberties. And then, and I relate the story of someone in my kind of family friend of mine who kind of lived that story. His father had been a Nazi, and he left Germany and moved to Brussels and worked at the EU and kind of dedicated his life to this project of not allowing this darkness to return. But he recently passed away, and I do think that the danger is that the norm in humanity is to trend towards nationalism, and as we see more and more places doing this, again, the danger I see on the horizon is technology can afford an enormous amount of power to governments, and I do think the Hong Kong example that I spend so much time on in this book is illustrative to us, because it's basically a situation where the people there didn't want this autocracy, but there's such total surveillance of a society and the capacity to see not just what people are posting on social media, but what they're emailing, what websites they visit, who might be interested in a set of values that runs contrary to the Chinese Communist Party. That danger of letting totalitarianism take hold, I think, is something that should sober us up. I think on the positive side, I talked to Hong Kong protesters, I talked to people like Alexei Navalny in Russia, I talked to democratic activists in places like Hungary. There is a mobilization happening of people who are much more aware of these trends. The conversation that is happening in this country and around the world about democracy today is far more advanced than a decade ago. People see the kind of authoritarian playbook that's being run, and they're figuring out different ways to push back. They're doing so by trying to assert that their identities as Russians or as Hong Kongers or as Hungarians is not inconsistent with democracy. They're exposing, in the case of Navalny, the kind of fundamental corruption of autocracies. And I think that is the Achilles heel of most autocrats, is the lavish corruption that usually is a source of serious popular blowback. And what they're also doing, and I think we have to do in the United States, and we did in the case of Joe Biden's victory, in a place like Hungary, the entire opposition has now decided we're going to put one big umbrella over this polyglot group of political parties. And they actually have a shot to beat Viktor Orban next year, despite how much he's kind of wired the system, because they're unified in defense of democracies. And I think that's what it's going to take. It's going to take, within countries and between countries, a real sense of unity and solidarity for those of us who believe in democracy. I think there are more of us that do than not. I think the idea that people would rather opt into the Chinese kind of model of prosperity and capitalism without any democracy, the lie was put to that by the fact that the people of Hong Kong clearly didn't want that. But we're going to have to be vigilant here. We're in I think, a pretty perilous and important moment for the next few years.
So talk a little bit about demography and race. It goes to your blood and soil point. Obviously, the demographic shifts here are driving a huge amount of what's unfolding in the United States. But I also wonder about demography in this sense. We started out as a country 80-20, right? 20% of the country did not want to rebel against Britain. And we've collapsed that ever since. So we had 81 million to 74 million in the Biden victory. My back of the envelope calculus, unburdened by data or responsibility, has been that if you could get 5 to 10 million people to essentially sober up along the lines you're talking about, you restore a certain stability to the democratic experiment that won't make it perennially durable, but at least would buy us some number of years. Does a number like that make any sense, or am I being too optimistic?
No, it does make sense. And actually, this is a conversation, I also had with Obama in the context of this book, which is that, look, there's always been, unfortunately, 30 to 35% of this country that would have voted for George Wallace, right? I mean, there's a strain of somewhat illiberal thinking, particularly when it comes to race. And I think what happened, it was interesting to kind of, I look at the Tea Party in this book, and I tried to look at it in the same way that I would look at these movements in other countries. Sometimes I think it's useful for us to step out of our own, it's like being in a family, and sometimes you have to look at it from the outside to understand what's happening. And when I look back at that, I see, okay, there's a lot of similarities to the backlash against globalization and capitalism, democracy, that I found in a place like Hungary, or to some extent earlier in a place like Russia, and we've seen in other countries, Brexit, chief among it. But when the Tea Party started, it was this blend of, I think, the grievances of people who felt, for lack of a better word, screwed by the financial crisis and were just angry at the whole system. Then you add to that a black person getting elected president of the United States, and it infused it with a kind of racialized backlash that I think added to the intensity. And, people, I remember very well, people chanting, "Take our country back" in the streets. And, the reason given was they were mad about deficit spending. You don't see the you don't see those protests happening now as Joe Biden deficit spends. You didn't see it when Trump did. So it felt racialized. And look, John, I think the reality is this country is going through a demographic convulsion. First, with kind of the question of who's in the room, and like a lot of people, I can look back and say, well, it seemed like it worked better. How come we could all kind of figure this stuff out? In the Cold War, there were these guardrails, and the parties kind of generally played by a commonly accepted set of rules. But those were only white men really making those rules, and I think there was an initial change to the fact that suddenly there's people of different colors and genders in the room, and that made our politics more complicated. And then you throw in the mix the fact that if current demographic trends continue, in certainly in my lifetime, this will become a majority non-white country, and whether it's conscious or not, I have to presume that some of the efforts to kind of entrench a certain kind of Republican Party foothold through the courts and through the voting laws and through the Senate, which is the least democratic of our elected institutions, part of that may be kind of buttressing, who controls power in this country, kind of in anticipation of that demographic change. And if that's truly what's happening, if we're kind of in this pivotal moment for the idea of multiracial democracy as we're becoming a more diverse country, the only way I think we're going to get through that peacefully with some degree of social cohesion and stability is if, as you say, there's a portion, I mean, just, whatever the number is, but it's not an enormous number, but enough of the kind of middle of the road folks here to stand up and say, we can't flirt with this illiberalism. We can't flirt with what the Republican Party is doing now. And Joe Biden's election was kind of that margin of victory of bringing back enough of those people into the fold in places like Pennsylvania and Wisconsin and Michigan that we kind of steadied the ship here. And the question is going to be election after election, can the Democrats and frankly all I think civil society in this country that cares about this thing, can we ensure that the dam doesn't break again as it did in 2016?
Let me ask you a counterfactual, which I know people love. Let's say 6 years ago, and this is in the context of your global point. 6 years ago, let's say Trump decides he's going to keep playing golf. Jeb, Bush, or Rubio, to use some Florida names, Cruz, whoever was in that field ends up faced off against Hillary, and let's say a Republican nominee who was not named Trump won in 2017, won in 2016, and became president. Do you think we're having this conversation?
I part of the reason why I wanted to tell this story in this book is that I think, yes, my experience of kind of being at the center of political power in this country for those 8 years was one of becoming increasingly aware of a kind of radicalization taking place in the Republican Party, for a bunch of reasons. But, before Donald Trump, we were already beginning to see, a ruthlessness and a kind of illiberalism to the kind of pursuit of power emanating from the Republican Party, and fueled, I think, in part by what I was describing with the fracturing of the media, the opening up of the floodgates to money in our politics. The Voting Rights Act was gutted by the courts. The Citizens United Act opened up this floodgate of money again into American politics. The McConnell and the kind of extremity of the obstructionism to Obama was there. Birtherism, obviously related to Trump, but conspiracy theory that like a healthy majority of Republican voters believed, in part because they're locked in this information ecosystem of what they're being mainlined on Facebook. That all created a circumstance where by the time Donald Trump comes down the escalator, he is the Republican Party. He was the front runner of that whole race. And it's interesting, if you remove him, as much as I think Jeb Bush would have been a different character, keep in mind, remember who the last man standing was after Donald Trump? It was Ted Cruz. Ted Cruz was the runner-up, and actually won a bunch of states. And I'm not sure Ted Cruz is any better, right? And so I think, yeah, if Jeb Bush was elected, we'd be in a different place. But I actually don't think there was any. I think the Republican Party couldn't nominate a Jeb Bush in 2016. It was only going to nominate somebody who reflected kind of the, for lack of a better way of putting it, the worldview of a Fox News viewer. And so I think we have to recognize that Trump, and again, looking at this globally, there's like a lot of Trumps out there. There's, again, like a Bolsonaro and Modi, Boris Johnson to some extent, Viktor Orban. Like, Trump is not alone in terms of being a kind of bombastic cult of personality nationalist. That's actually, the trend. Bibi Netanyahu right now in Israel is saying that the election was stolen from him. And so this is happening, and it's happening in too many places to think that this is all because Donald Trump just came along.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that when we write the history of this era, it would make this timeline. I'm reminded of what Henry Adams said about the move from Washington to Grant disproved Darwin. To some extent, the movement from a Romney-Ryan ticket to Trump. Now, if it had gone straight from, if Palin had caught fire after you all beat her in that interregnum, in that period, the line would be clearer to me. It gives me some scintilla of hope, but I do think the franchise model of Trumpism in the United States, and you're making the point that it's also a global one, is incredibly sobering. And I honestly, I've been doing this a long time now. I didn't think we would be having a plausible conversation, a hysterical, data-driven conversation about the durability of American democracy. Let me ask you about January 6th. Where were you? What was your reaction?
So, what was so interesting to me about that is I was finishing kind of the final review of this book that I'd written about what leads to authoritarianism.
At least it didn't upset your thesis.
Well, that's the thing. That's what was so jarring, is how logical it was.
I was right.
I basically had been, writing about how conspiracy theory had embedded itself deep within this kind of strain of authoritarianism in America, the kind of information ecosystem that juices a sense of grievance, the kind of disregard for norms that can lead to even more extreme behavior. So, what may start with, there is a connection between saying we're going to stop respecting the norm of like not meddling in Justice Department investigations, or, even the way we approach, issues like the court. Once you kind of start breaking through the democratic guardrails, you can lose control of that. And so I always, because I was looking at these other countries that were really losing it. I mean, Russia there's not a trace of democracy in Russia anymore. There's certainly not in China. Hungary is further on the spectrum than we are. I'd seen places where, the unthinkable keeps, what you think is the extreme version of what can happen keeps advancing. While I'm writing this book, the Hong Kong protest movement that I'm kind of profiling gets swallowed up. Alexei Navalny, who's my main character in Russia, gets poisoned in prison. Like, I keep seeing the worst thing happen in places. And I was watching this when, after the election, when Trump wasn't, abiding by it, and people kind of laughing. They're laughing at like Rudy Giuliani and how absurd this all is. But it didn't look that funny to me. Like, it was a president not like acceding to a peaceful transfer of power, and his own political party kind of sheepishly backing him up was new terrain. And we had trouble kind of finding the language even to describe what was happening, because with Trump, I mean, one of the problems is he's such a cartoonish character that sometimes you fail to take seriously enough, like exactly what's happening before your eyes, you know? And so I was watching it at home, and I was watching because there'd been such a buildup. You know, I was actually watching the debate on C-SPAN, I remember, and then I just start to see these reports, and you know, I walked into that building so many times, John, because I used to have to go talk to Congress a lot. I drew that straw, and it's a majestic experience to walk into the U.S. Capitol. And the best thing about it is that you could just walk in. You know, like it's not a fortress like the White House, and you sense the history around you. You hear the echoes off the marble walls, and to see that kind of temple of democracy invaded like that, in a way, John, that like I've seen that happens in other countries. The parliament is often overrun by the supporters of some autocrat or populist. That's not, you know, again, what Americans realize is like these aren't uncommon things. We just didn't think they could happen here. And to me, that was my main takeaway from that event is, again, it can happen here. Like anything can happen here. Like we thought we were the country that had kind of escaped from history, that had figured this out, that had this story of an inclusive, multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy where we worked this out peacefully. And what January 6th really drove home to me was the extent to which, no, we have to recognize anything can happen here. And we should learn from the fact that it's happened in lots of other places.
Last uber dorky question, but I'm playing to type. What you said a minute ago about the post-Cold War world argues that Samuel Huntington was probably largely correct in The Clash of Civilizations, right? And I'm wondering, as you watch the Democratic Party now and where the Republicans are in weaponizing everything, do you have any cause for alarm? Are you anxious about the future of identity politics? That is, that I'm thinking about it. I live in Tennessee. When the Tennessee legislature bans teaching something, it tends not to work out. You can ask H.L. Mencken about that. But my legislature has banned the teaching of critical race theory, and I think Florida's done it too. I'm just curious where you see that debate. It feels like this just, in my mixed metaphors, just add water wedge issue. But the argument that the president has to make, and that you're making, and the President Obama made, is if we are devoted to the Declaration of Independence, then equality of opportunity has to be the engine. And it doesn't matter what you look like or where you came from. And Republicans are with you until that part. And so I'm just wondering how you see the politics of identity unfolding.
Yeah, no, I think this is the issue we have to figure out. And it's why I kind of subtitled this book, you know, Being American in the World We Made, because we have to figure out again what it means to be American. That's a very contested thing right now. I mean, I'd say two things about this, John, is like the first, I found strikingly, again, in this kind of playbook, authoritarians always try to control history. You know, in just this book, I walked through this story of how essentially the Chinese Communist Party has completely whitewashed any study or awareness even of Tiananmen. Like it's out of the schools, it's offline, you cannot find it on the internet. And I had young people, you know, kind of about 30 years old from China telling me that like they didn't know what happened in Tiananmen until they left China and learned about it. You know, in Russia, Putin has significantly tried to whitewash in the curriculum the excesses of Stalinism, given, you know, Putin's own affinity for a certain brand of total control. In Hungary, Orban has really dug into the curriculum to kind of downplay the crimes of the right in Hungary, who were collaborators with the Nazis and complicit in the Holocaust, elevate the crimes of the communists because that's the left. And so these you know, again, what can seem like a cable news debate like the idea that you want to control what history is about not just the past, it's about the future, right? And that's why historians like you are so important, because if we don't learn the full complexity of the past, there's an agenda for that. We have to know where the darkness of kind of white nationalism can lead. That's why we need to learn about Tulsa. We need to deal with structural inequities in society. That's why you have to understand why those structural inequities exist. And seeking to whitewash that is a way of, I think, controlling not just the understanding of the past, but kind of narrowing the pathway for the future. I think, the challenge for Democrats is this. How do you embrace, and Obama was really good at this, how do you embrace the need for change, progressive change, if you will, without having that be a rejection of the past, a rejection of American identity? Obama would always say, like, in no other country is my story possible. That there's yes, a country founded with slavery, like that is something we obviously fully reject. But that the evolution set in motion by the founders was the capacity to keep making this place better. And so with each leap forward for civil rights or social equality, it's an extension of the American story, not a rejection of it. Because it's very hard to go to people, whether they're in northern England or in rural Hungary or in Tennessee, and tell them, in order to kind of embrace change, you have to kind of reject who you thought you were entirely. And I tell this story at the end of the book about this kind of joyful speech that Obama gave in Selma, which well, on the anniversary, which I think is his greatest speech. And he asked me and the other speechwriter, Cody Keenan, to assemble a canon of the progressive heroes, or not even progressive, the underdogs of American society. And so we make this list, and it's Harriet Tubman and Sojourner Truth and Jackie Robinson and Emerson and Thoreau and Whitman and the inventors of jazz and the inventors of country and western and everybody who kind of looked at power from the outside, the pioneers for women's rights. And he kind of joyfully kind of did this recitation. And I realized he was claiming American history for everybody, and that to me is the answer. Like that we are all part of our history. We all have to be a part of our future. It's a story of progress, and it's a story of progress that doesn't ask, someone in Tennessee to reject who they are, but ask them to continue to be a part of this journey of making America better. That's a hopeful framing of it. And I think the trap for the Democratic Party can be sometimes, things I'm very sympathetic with in terms of the pursuit of social justice and racial justice can be framed in ways that are not, a story of like continued progression, but rather, for understandable reasons, basically challenging people to reject deeply held parts of their identity. And I think that's just a harder message, frankly, for the achievement of democratic progress than a more inclusive approach like an Obama and a Biden has taken to this.
Yeah. One of the things, when I try feebly to make that case, I'd like to say that the folks who hit the beach at Omaha Beach were not doing it as captors.
Yeah.
They were doing it as liberators, right? Yeah. And that's the American story. One small anecdote about the Tiananmen Square. I'm George H.W. Bush's biographer, and the Chinese publishers reached out and said, "We'd love to publish it in China. By the way, could you take out the chapter about Tiananmen Square?" No, we can't. So, I know we're gonna get some questions. Let me ask you a last question. This is actually George H.W. Bush's 97th birthday, if he were still with us. He was in power when the wall fell, when the Soviet Union dissolved on Christmas Day, 1991. Over the last 30 years, what should we have done as a country to secure guardrails that are now so flimsy to non-existent? And what does that tell us about what we can do going forward?
So, there are a couple of things. The first is, I think that, America has been both an enormously positive influence on the world, but also I think in some ways has been a negative influence in other areas. And usually in the last 30 years, where we've run afoul and made mistakes is through excess. And I think when you achieve a level of power in the world that the United States achieved at the end of the Cold War, almost unparalleled in human history, power corrupts, power leads to excess. And in some ways, in tracing the story in this book, like, it made me reckon with the reality that, like, the excess of the explosion of markets and the explosion of capitalism around the world, there was excess in the inequality it created, and in chiefly the financial crisis, the kind of unregulated explosion of capitalism leads to the bottom falling out and a lot of loss of confidence in America. That was the excess of kind of a profit-driven society. The excesses of the post 9/11 moment, whether it's the invasion and occupation in Iraq, torture. People will say that, under Obama, like, obviously the continued prosecution of the war on terror. I do think that those excesses were mimicked by authoritarians. The Chinese use the phrase "people's war on terror" for what they're doing to their Uyghur population. Putin has used counterterrorism as a justification. It doesn't make us responsible, but I do think the excesses of that war, did bleed into other places. And then the excesses of technology, the deployment of these tools before we kind of fully understand what they would do to a society, which is common in American history. Usually it takes some time to catch up to new technologies. Yeah. I think those are the excesses. And the other thing that I was forced to reckon with in the China example is, I kind of just went back through how did they get from Tiananmen to now? From this moment where they looked like they were on the losing end of history to it looks like they are the future right now. And there's a lot to that story. But, I also think that if you look at the American relationship with China, the way I put this in the book is I had this kind of sobering experience in Shanghai. I'm there with former President Obama in 2017. I get woken up in the middle of the night by some Chinese officials who want to warn me that Obama should not meet with the Dalai Lama in India, which is a normal warning for them. But what was weird about it, other than them waking me up, is that we hadn't announced the meeting. so they basically were aired my email or the Dalai Lama's guy's email. So I wander outside and I look at the Shanghai skyline, which kind of looks like the future. It's glittering skyscrapers, lights everywhere. Everybody's taking selfies. And I kind of thought to myself, well, this is kind of a logical next step. If you take these 30 years of American dominance, the capitalism, the technology, the national security fixation, and you just strip out any democratic values, you would get what I was looking at and what I'd experienced in Shanghai. And I think we didn't prioritize democracy enough at home and abroad. If I think about the Chinese relationship, every president, Bush, Clinton, Bush, Obama, Trump, there was always a higher priority with the Chinese, for instance. With us, it was like the financial crisis and then the Paris Agreement and climate change. Good things that you have to work with the Chinese on, but causes you to be a little cautious on democracy. H.W. Bush, was seeking to kind of land, this better than me, but kind of let them out off the hook in some ways after Tiananmen, in part because we were moving out of the Cold War and we thought that these things were settled and we thought there'd be time to kind of have China do an evolution. Clinton brings him into international trade because he wants access to those markets because that's going to raise American living standards. Again, understandable, but deprioritized democracy. Bush wanted partnership in the war on terror. And when I think about those kind of four things, security, national security, profit and capitalism, technology, and democracy, we never prioritize democracy in a relationship with China as much as those other three things. If you were the Chinese, you would think that the Americans care more about profit, national security, technological innovation than democracy. The trade-off always put democracy lower. And I think that's something was kind of mirrored at home too. I go back to Clinton and it's not a criticism because it is what it is. It was a good slogan, but it's the economy, stupid, kind of became the mantra of, government is about economic, it's all about the economy. In the Cold War, for all our flaws, values had to be front and center. Like our national identity was anchored in the reality that we were for a set of values, freedom and democracy, and the other guys weren't. And that was a part of what it meant to be American, and certainly our politics. And, other than kind of the, I think, somewhat problematic embrace of democracy after the Iraq War as kind of a justification for what we were doing in the Middle East, I think democracy has been too deprioritized in our domestic affairs and our global affairs.
We'll take some questions. I'll just tell you, there's an analog story quickly while Miami weighs in. Barbara Bush, when they were Bush, I think, was the second representative before we had diplomatic relations. And she complained one day in 1974 that she didn't have any stamps, and George was the only person in the room. And the next day there was a box of stamps.
Yeah.
So
something's never changed. Yeah.
Exactly. Yes, ma'am.
So we have a question from Katie. In both your books, you speak very highly about Chancellor Merkel and how her style of politics has influenced even Obama. Since she's not running in the German elections this year, do you think that her stepping down will cause a shift in the world order in general? And how will it influence the relations between the US and the EU?
It's a look. Angela Merkel has been, and I think the history books, will look back and say that she was the port in the storm. She was the fortress of democracy and democratic values in Europe at a very stormy time. I mean, through the aftermath of the Iraq War, through the financial crisis, through this rising tide of liberalism, through Brexit. I described in my first book that she told Obama when he went to visit her after Trump's election, she was not going to run for another term as chancellor. Trump's election is what motivated her to run, because she's like, somebody's got to kind of mind the store for the free world here, And so we owe her a debt of gratitude. I also think, though, it's, she's been around for a very long time, and there does have to be a change. I think what it does mean is that German politics will be a little bit more fractured. And for the EU, she was the first call that you always made. And now that's kind of an open question. And the challenge is, I think the world's democracies, as President Biden is trying to do now, need to kind of come together around a whole bunch of issues right now. And that's actually going to get a little harder without her kind of marshaling consensus in Europe. But I mean, we're definitely in a better place than we were 5 years ago when Obama had that conversation with her after Trump's election. So I think she leaves feeling like, there's enough antibodies and there's been enough pushback in Europe against this kind of far right nationalism that, the baton can be passed here.
Thank you. So from Andrew, in light of her tremendous success during the 2020 elections, what role do you see Stacey Abrams playing in protecting the franchise for all U.S. citizens going forward?
Look, I think she's really the template. I mean, when people ask me what do we need to do, what can we do, I say, look at what Stacey Abrams has done, because, like, for instance, looking at the current effort around voting rights, I'm frustrated, obviously, like a lot of people, that Joe Manchin doesn't want to support that. The filibuster is being used to kind of entrench what I think are anti-democratic trends. But I think it'd be wrong to just kind of throw up your hands and be like, well, we have to wait for Joe Manchin. That's not how change happens in this country. Change happens when you go out and you register people to vote, and you organize them. And sometimes you have to win more than one election to get done what you want to get done. And sometimes you have to educate people on the ground. Okay, there are these voter restrictions, but here's how you can still vote. And so I think she is really the model for what civil society needs to do in this country, not just through the 2020 election, but I think it's going to be for a few elections here. Each one is going to feel pretty existential, at least for the next 2 and 4 years. So I think we should look to her, and frankly, other people around the world have looked to her as an example of how to organize people who've been left out of the political process and assert, your political power when people are trying to keep it from you.
Thank you. Here is a question for both of you. Are there any places in the world that are giving you optimism about the future of democracy?
I can go first, John. I mean, there are a couple of things that are making me optimistic. One thing which I, again, focus on in my book is we're seeing a lot of popular mobilization around the world. And again, some of it's not succeeding, as in Hong Kong. But if you look at Hong Kong and Belarus and movements against inequality in Latin America and the Black Lives Matter movement and the way that went global, even climate strikes, there's a kind of mass mobilization that is happening, particularly among young people. And you could say, well, these movements are failing, but movements fail and fail and fail until they succeed. And usually it's kind of a dam breaking. And then there are other trends like young people getting involved in politics, and particularly young women getting elected to office. If you look at Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand, or if you look at recent people who have been elected prime minister in a number of European countries who are women in their 30s and early 40s, it seems to represent kind of a particular backlash to the, if the nationalist kind of authoritarian trend I'm describing was a bit of a backlash to liberalism and globalization, there's now a bit of a backlash happening to that. And you've seen that in a bunch of different elections around the world, particularly in Europe and in Canada, obviously. And so I think there's cause for hope, but I think we also just have to recognize it. We're not moving in the right direction right now. And America gave itself a second chance with the election of Joe Biden, but it's not settled here either. So while the bright spots to me, though, speak to, again, the pendulum maybe being prepared to swing back, young people getting involved, people mobilizing, more women moving into higher office. All that kind of suggests where things may go if we're able to turn the tide.
Yeah, I'll just say very quickly to connect the last two questions. To me, it's the state of Georgia, not the nation of Georgia. But without the voters of Georgia, Joe Biden is in a very different place. The country's in a very different place with those Senate races. Part of this is my deep historical affection for John Lewis and what that insistent movement in the face of state-sponsored, white supremacist, totalitarian violence. That's what the civil rights movement was. And it was 55 years ago, 56 years ago. So almost in our lifetime, we dealt with something that if you took it out of the context of American history and looked at it, you would think, oh, that couldn't be us. Well, of course it's us. Of course it is. And I know a lot about Georgia. It's a state that has given us Raphael Warnock and Marjorie Taylor Greene. And so if you're looking, and Stacey Abrams. And so if you're looking for a microcosm of what works and what doesn't work on all the issues we're talking about, I think Georgia's the place to look.
So we have quite a few questions, but we only have time for one more. So here's a good one. You describe how the autocratic side has found its identity in hatred and nationalism. What do you think should be the identity of the progressive side?
So, I thought a lot about this, because I also had to kind of unlearn some things in writing this book. I realized that my political consciousness was formed around the end of the Cold War. That's, when I was kind of starting to pay attention to things, which did suggest a seeming inevitability that we'd figured out this identity question. We were for freedom, and freedom won, and that's it. And bad things may happen along the way, but the journey is kind of preordained. And having unlearned that, I thought a lot about American identity. And I describe in the book kind of bottoming out, like a lot of us did during the pandemic. I'm home, I'm working on this book. And, you have COVID, you've got the incompetence, kind of cruel incompetence of the government. You have BLM happen. And I'm walking my daughter around my neighborhood, and all the shops are boarded up with murals painted of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd and other people who've been killed. And I'm having to explain to my daughter, these are Black people who were killed by white people. But then I tried to explain to her about Martin Luther King, who she learned about in school. And remember, Dr. King addressed this, and we've made progress. And then with the kind of 6-year-old child's wisdom, she said to me, "But Daddy, Dr. King was killed by a white man too, you know." And then the kind of like a street scene, because you're taking the same walk in COVID. The National Guard was deployed there the next day, and I'm having to explain to her, why are there soldiers in our streets, And I was really angry. And then the next day I come out and there's a protest, and I'm by myself this time, and I kind of join in this protest, and it's an incredibly diverse crowd being led by Black people. And I'm totally anonymous. It was kind of a full transition from being this guy in the White House who's like in the room when things are being decided. I'm just a middle-aged guy with a mask, walking in this crowd of people, and we all kneel down at the end. And I'm looking around at particularly the Black faces in the crowd. I'm thinking, these people have much more reason than me to give up on America, to say, this place is just rigged against me. The whole system has been built against me. And they're out here trying to make America live up to its better story. Whatever you think about the Black Lives Matter movement, the idea that people are channeling their anger towards, like, we need to improve this place we're in. And to me, that's the American identity that I settle on. And I think it's what my former boss would settle on, is it's about doing the work. Like, that's our identity, that this is a multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy, but it's not preordained. And each generation does have to do the work. We have to struggle against our own demons and face down that darker story inside of America. But we also have to do our own part to say we are the story we tell ourselves about being a democracy where anybody from anywhere in the world can come here and be American. And if we can do that, and this is the hope I find. Yes, there's been a fall here, but that means we're recognizable to people around the world. We're not just sitting on a mountaintop lecturing people about democracy. We are working this through right now. And if we can do that, and we can again assert that our identity is, you can be from anywhere and be American, you can look like anything, you can believe anything, and you can be an American here, then I think that really will ripple out around the world. So we have an opportunity, but we have to embrace that identity of doing the work.
I love that. We have to do the work. And you certainly do the work every day. So thank you. Congratulations for this book. And I just want to thank you both for joining Books and Books tonight, for supporting us, being here in our little virtual bookshop. And I hope that the next time it's going to be in person. I'll just thank our viewers for joining us and remind everyone, you can purchase a copy of After the Fall. Green box. Anyway, thank you so much. And good night, everyone.
Thank you, guys.
Be well. Bye.